Welcome to the Ocean Renewable Energy Conference, and virtually welcome to the Pacific Northwest. A couple of us are coming to you from Portland, and this is the session on the pivotal role of ocean energy in strategies for rapid decarbonization and adaptation of the Pacific Northwest energy sector. My name is Shannon Souza. I'm the Policy Director for Pacific Ocean Energy Trust. And over the course of the past 18 months, we've been closely tracking all of the evolutions in our energy markets, evaluation tools, and infrastructure. Everything is in a state of flux here in the Pacific Northwest, as elsewhere in the nation and the globe. In each of these cases, comprehensive systemic updates are required to respond to the exponential rates of change we are experiencing in our climate, our clean energy technology, and our societal expectations. All the while, we are in the Northwest simultaneously balancing significant population growth and increased demands. Federal, state, and Northwest agencies and planning organizations are all developing and evaluating various pathways to navigate this just clean energy transition. In the Pacific Northwest, the Northwest Power Planning and Conservation Council recently released its 5-year update draft 2021 power plan for comment. This plan will likely serve as a market signal and basis from which the rapidly developing Northwest Power Pool voluntary resource adequacy program will evolve. However, the equally rapidly emergent technologies of floating offshore wind and renewable hydrogen were not included as basic scenario options. Meanwhile, concurrent modeling exercises undertaken or underway by the private and national lab sectors utilize more comprehensive data sets and modern frameworks, which include offshore wind and renewable hydrogen technologies. What role will these emergent offshore wind resources play in complementing and stabilizing tomorrow's Western grid? How might the capacity contributions of Pacific Northwest ocean energy be extended to the West Coast and Pacific Rim, transportation and maritime sectors through hybrid pairing with decarbonized fuel generation, such as renewable hydrogen? Our first panelist is Fred Hewitt. Fred is a senior policy associate with the Northwest Energy Coalition. He continues to play a leadership role in advocacy and engagement in regional and state planning endeavors, and brings with him a comprehensive and extensive understanding of market and infrastructure implications born of his ample experience. Fred is a trusted advisor and invaluable resource, and we really appreciate his time today to provide us with some context for this timely topic. Fred.
Morning, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon. Let's see, do I need to share my screen here? I think. By the way, the backdrop there is Netarts, Oregon, a little far north of where the really good offshore wind is in Oregon. Let's see if I can find my slides here. Are you able to see that? How's that looking?
Looks great. Thanks.
Okay. I have to deal with all the tech here, I guess. Hold on. Let's see. So on to our organization. Northwest Energy Coalition is based in the 4 Northwest states, and also we have some members in British Columbia who have a wide range of groups, including environmental, civic groups, etc., some utilities, and some energy clean energy development group companies. Our mission is to advance clean, equitable, and affordable energy policies across the Northwest. We've been doing this for quite a while now. On offshore wind, we are certainly, and I'm certainly not an expert. You all here are the experts, but we do have some perspectives on this based on looking at the overall regional context in the Northwest. So what I'll discuss here in the next few minutes, future of demand in the Northwest, the changing resource mix, offshore wind potential as we see it, and some transmission issues, This won't, I won't be getting to everything. I'm not really going to talk about California or Washington offshore wind, developments in power markets, various, environmental, cultural, and local economic considerations. Those are all, happy to give you my opinions, but I'll try to focus more on directly on the energy context. The first thing to start with is, what does future demand look like in the Northwest? As I'll show in a moment, our power demand has basically been pretty flat for the last couple of decades, mostly because energy efficiency has been very successful. Our organization really strongly supports energy efficiency or conservation. And that is probably going to be changing somewhat as we see new load coming on the system from transportation, from electric vehicles and buildings. The pace and scale of those obviously are pretty open, but we know that's coming. I'm going to refer here to the draft 2021 Northwest Power Plan. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council just issued that last week. We have a lot of concerns about the plan, starting with the fact it doesn't really give much real recognition to the potential for offshore wind, but there are many aspects of it that are quite valuable, and the demand forecast is good stuff. One of the interesting things is the council is now projecting that we will probably see some additional regional population growth, which of course drives demand in the next couple of decades as climate change starts to affect the rest of the country and we get more in-migration. So that's one interesting new development that we're looking at. This is a chart showing the demand history of the region. This is an annual average chart, not a peak demand chart, going all the way back to the 1980s. And you can see how it dropped in the late 90s, early 2000s, part because of the recession and part because of the California power crisis, which dropped off a lot of the aluminum plants, very large industrial loads left shut down, and that load stopped. Since then, as you can see, we've had pretty flat demand. Going forward, we have projections here, high, medium, and low. And actually, we think that the higher demand trend is probably more likely due to building and transportation electrification. So just to give you some context, that the demand in the system is definitely going to be shifting going forward. And need I mention also climate change, which basically affects, decreases winter demand somewhat and increases summer demand, as we saw this year. In the transportation sector, this is the council's estimate, and we think this is probably a pretty constrained view, could be a lot faster. We can see seeing some transportation demand right now, and then it ramps up pretty rapidly after that. Now, the scale over here on the left, up to 1,000 megawatts by the 2040s, could be higher than that, but it does indicate a pretty significant shift. On the supply side, we have a dramatic shift already underway, obviously. Primarily, it's on the side of the investor-owned utilities. Public power, which is the other roughly, I'd say, half of the Northwest, is primarily hydro supplied by the Bonneville Power Administration and by some independently owned dams as well. On the investor-owned side, they have a somewhat more diverse resource mix with a lot of coal and gas, and coal is going out. Gas is eventually going to go out. We have a lot of new uptake of wind and solar, in particular wind for sure, over the last 2 decades, and beginning to see some solar as climate and policy and energy policy drive that, and technology innovation is also moving forward very quickly. Looking at the coal, we can see that as of a couple of years ago, we had about 7,000 megawatts of coal serving the Northwest. A couple of the coal plants are actually out in Wyoming, not technically part of the Pacific Northwest, but were built for Northwest purposes. And you can see that that coal fleet has already begun retiring. We had 2 big plants retire last December, the Boardman coal plant in Oregon and Unit 1 of Centralia up in Washington, near Centralia, Washington. Between Portland and Seattle, and there are more coming. This chart doesn't show the Colstrip 3 and 4 plants, which have not yet been formally announced for a early retirement, but I think we all expect that, and probably by the mid 2020s, which is about 1,400 megawatts. And the Wyoming and Utah coal plants that serve Pacific Core East in Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming, not included here either, but they're really part of our perspective. So you can see the coal is really moving down fast. The new onshore renewables that are coming in, I didn't really talk about this directly, but we have a lot of wind in the Northwest, over 8,000 megawatts. We haven't had much solar yet, but we're going to see a lot more. Those new renewables that are replacing the coal and eventually the gas need some partners. The coal and the gas kind of complete resources. They supply energy, capacity, ancillary services. They're not perfect, but they are out there and we know how they work, and they work pretty well. But there are definitely some problems, certainly with the emissions, also with fuel cycle issues with coal and the coal's residuals and so on, air emissions, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. And but those resources are basically pretty well established, and we have to replace all of their services in order to have a secure grid. Wind and solar can supply a lot of that, but they are energy limited. So the question is, what fills the gaps when you need it, when those resources are not directly available? And the answer is, we have a lot of answers for that. We have a lot of options, and more energy efficiency, which helps everything work better, demand response, and storage. We haven't developed very much of either of those yet in the Northwest. We have about 7,000 megawatts of energy efficiency, and we can do more. So we have a lot there, but there are other things that could be done. One is to diversify the geographic layout of the renewables in the region to decrease their correlation and increase the overall production. That's something where offshore wind can really add a lot. A lot of headroom for our Oregon offshore wind going forward. When you look at this as the council's assessment of new renewables needed in order to achieve an early coal retirement. See, the red is the baseline, the blue is early coal retirement, the dotted line, and the dark blue is the early coal retirement with no new gas. That means that by 2030, we would have to get upwards of 8,000 megawatts to maybe 12,000 megawatts of new renewables. A few thousand megawatts of that is already committed, but we need a lot more. So by the late 2020s and into the 2030s, there's a big opportunity for Oregon offshore wind. The PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Lab, has done a really great study on offshore wind potential for the Oregon coast. They have a couple of publications, but that one in particular. And what's really striking here is the capacity factor on peak, both morning and evening, for South Coast Oregon winds, over 60%. That's on an annual basis. Obviously, it varies up and down monthly and so forth. But those numbers are basically effectively close to double of the wind capacity factor we have for the Columbia Gorge, for example. Montana wind is somewhat higher, but not that high. So this is very valuable potential resource in terms of the energy mix. And you can see across the landscape here, we have a potential for offshore wind, more gorge wind, Oregon and Washington east side solar, and of course Wyoming wind, and although it's not listed here, Montana wind, which could be a very good complementary set of renewable resources for the grid. On the transmission side, we have two big regional grids, Bonneville Power Administration and Pacific Core. They both have over 15,000 line miles. Pacific Core stretches across 6 states. Bonneville covers a lot of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and a little bit of Montana. They are both very large systems, but they both have very limited capacity for new resources right now. And both of them actually have the corner of their transmission footprints are right there on the Oregon coast, right adjacent to the potential areas for offshore wind. The ATC is limited, but as the PNNL study showed, it's enough to get started. And there are a couple of important findings in the PNNL study. One is that The Oregon offshore wind will help balance flows into the load centers, which primarily now almost entirely come either from nearby, like in the Portland or Seattle area where there are a lot of gas plants, or coming across the Cascades from the east, the hydro and the wind at this point and solar in the future. Those flows across the Cascades are massive. And in order to, if we had more flow coming from the west or the southwest from the Oregon offshore, that actually would provide more balanced flows and actually increase the amount of ATC going over the Cascades. Secondly, having a separate source of supply, not just from the east, but from the south coast, would give us more reliability. Pretty obvious result there. Importantly, for the Oregon coast itself, which is really, especially the southwest coast, has lots of issues with power quality, power interruptions. A local supply there would be a major benefit for the coast. We will need new transmission going forward. We will have to do it to achieve the full capacity of the offshore resource. Of course, that means long lead times, very expensive, and cost and schedule risk. These are things we know how to deal with, but we have to plan for them. We'll get major reliability benefits from that transmission expansion, as I mentioned, just to enhance the flows, balance the flows, especially into the I-5 corridor from Seattle or the Canadian border down to Ashland, Oregon, down at the California border. There are difficult issues in going over the coast range, although it's not that high. It's difficult terrain, and there are lots and lots of complexities getting new transmission built. There is a potential, I think, for converting some of that transmission to DC and getting more capacity. Hasn't really been studied yet, but it's something that we're thinking about in order to improve the cross coast range flow. And there are going to be system reinforcements needed both on the coast and in the interior. But there's more. One of the interesting possibilities is to connect the Oregon offshore wind down to the California offshore wind at the Humboldt call area and going further south into the California mainland. There are lots of questions that have to be addressed here. It's not, an absolute cinch. There's physical, is it even possible to do that? It's a difficult undersea terrain in that area. A large cost. There are a lot of coordination issues, but there would be very high value if we could do that. Economic value going both directions for Oregon and California offshore wind, and reliability. And I'm going to talk about this for just a moment. We've had 3 near misses on the intertie system. Pacific intertie consists of the AC intertie, about 4,800 megawatts of total capacity, running from basically the Columbia River down to California, Northern California, and the DC intertie running from the Columbia River down to Los Angeles. That one's about 3,200 megawatts. So about 8,000 megawatts total. We've had more than, significant constraints, reduction of transmission capacity because of wildfire 3 times in the last couple of years. The bootleg fire, I think everybody knows about, earlier this summer, and then 2 previous ones in 2019. This is a big wake-up call for the importance of finding a new alternate bypass or backup for the main AC and DC interties.
Ed, we've had a question. Could you explain what ATC is?
Yeah, available transmission capacity. It's basically how much is available on a transmission line or path that has not been contractually committed. In the Northwest, we have bilateral transmission deals, basically. So, for example, Bonneville has a certain capacity in a certain portion of the system. They calculate how much ATC there is for different seasons and make that available on long-term firm or conditional firm contracts, for example. So the ATC, for example, if you have a, let's just take a hypothetical example, you've got a path with 1,000 megawatt path rating, total path rating. If 800 of it has been committed under contract, you have 200 megawatts of ATC. So that's, there's a constantly refreshed calculation of how much of that is available. That in turn affects how much can be brought in from the transmission queue. I won't get into all of that and how Bonneville does that. Both they and PacifiCorp now both have a kind of open season cluster study approach. But the point is, both systems, both Bonneville and Peck, by far the two largest grids in the Northwest, both have very limited ATC right now, pretty much everywhere. There are certain places that might have some more and some that have none at all, but basically we're pretty tight. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you.
Just to go back to the bootleg fire again, this is the kind of risk that we have. Here you see 3 lines. This is in south sort of central Oregon, south of Summer Lake, Oregon, going down toward Klamath Falls. Those 3 lines are each owned independently. Bonneville owns one, PacifiCorp owns one, Portland General Electric owns one. You're looking at about 4,400 megawatts of transmission capacity in that picture, which had to go down because of the fire that went under the lines or near the lines, and had to, for safety reasons, the lines relayed out in the early July at a time when California was quite hot, and caused a close call in California, near miss, requiring them to go to stage 2. The DC intertie, which is not near here, it's actually further east, also had to be derated because if the full AC line is out at this particular area, the DC line is a little fragile, and so to reduce the risk of an uncontrolled outage, they reduce the flow. So we lost over 5,000 megawatts of flow going to California, 5,000 out of total California demand around maybe 45,000. So very significant reliability impairment. This is one of the things I think we ought to be thinking about. Yes, an offshore DC loop is a bit of a long shot. Let me go to the next slide here. Our friend Bill Henry put together this chart just to illustrate, not exactly, it's more of an illustration, not an actual map. But you can see the AC intertie, that big orange line in the middle there, and then the DC line right next to it that runs from the Columbia River down to LA, and a dotted line representing a kind of an offshore wind DC loop concept. So this is something we should be thinking about. It would take a long time to do, but it could be very important for regional reliability. It's another aspect of offshore wind development. Moving on to cost, and I'll be wrapping up here. The cost, from our perspective, it's an expensive resource, but it's going to be getting cheaper. And I'm sure many people in this on this webinar have their own ideas about how much those costs are. And I would say the NREL annual technology baseline, they're very careful in their analysis, but they are just projections at this point for costs for floating offshore wind. And my guess is we will probably see lower costs than this. You know, about $4,500 a kilowatt now is their estimate. Nobody's got one ready to go, obviously, declining to $3,500 by 2030. Well, you know, could that come down more? It probably could, but we don't know. But just to give a sense of it, $3,500 a kilowatt is about the same as the cost of rooftop solar today. So it's not out of reach. You know, it's pretty expensive resource, but it's not out of reach. But that's not the important point. The important point goes back to the question of capacity factor and the value that that provides to the grid. If you look at it in life cycle cost of energy terms, you know, kind of spread out the cost and look at it per megawatt hour, and by 2030, the NREL ATB moderate case, not the advanced case, goes at about $50 a megawatt hour. Well, that's more expensive than onshore wind or solar, or even those plus batteries, but it's not that bad. And really, given the shape that the offshore wind provides, that's really well matched to the grid needs we've got in the Northwest, that looks like a pretty attractive thing to add in with all the other things we're talking about on the clean energy side. So our conclusion, I would say my conclusion and personal opinion at the moment is responsibly developed offshore wind will be a great partner. It's not a standalone solution. It could be an important part of a balanced clean resource portfolio. We have a multi-thousand megawatt potential. It complements the onshore new renewables and the customer side resources. And the value can be enhanced with battery and hydrogen storage associated with the offshore wind. And finally, transmission co-development is a key factor. So I hope that helps provide some context, and happy to go forward on the discussion.
Thank you, Fred. I think what we'll do today is we'll go ahead and proceed with the next two presentations and hold questions for the end, because I think that if we look at them all together, there's kind of a nice fitting together of concepts. Up next, we have Jeremy Hargreaves. He's the principal at Evolved Energy Research, and I'm going to call him the mastermind behind the recently completed and released Oregon Clean Energy Pathways Analysis. This analysis was designed to examine the technical and economic implications of accelerating decarbonization in Oregon. The importance of this endeavor cannot be overstated, as the results are intended to inform policymaking in Oregon. Thank you, Jeremy, for taking time to join us today in spite of your flu. We're looking forward to you sharing your potentially transformative findings.
Thanks very much, Shannon. So everybody should see the slides up on the screen just now. So what I wanted to do today is give kind of a high-level overview of what we found in the Clean Energy Pathway Study for Oregon, with a focus on offshore wind, because I think one of the big takeaways is the development of offshore wind in Oregon, not just as part of a resource plan for Oregon electricity loads, but more broadly as part of a West-wide least cost solution when thinking about what kind of resources are we building out. And as Fred was describing, what are the resources that are complementary to one another? And Oregon offshore wind fits that bill very nicely when thinking about what are the loads and what are the resources available across the West to us. The full report is available on the Clean Energy Transition website. The project team here was Clean Energy Transition Institute, Renewable Northwest, and Grid Lab, as well as a technical review committee that helped us along the way frame up what the scenarios look like and talk through what the results coming out of the modeling exercise were. So the study evaluated clean energy pathways for Oregon, exploring how to achieve the emissions goals that Oregon has set out, clean electricity goals. And the way that it works is that we think about all of the ways in which how we consume energy over time might change. So on the demand side, we consume fuels, we consume electricity. As we start to move into new kinds of technologies, greater efficiency in the future, then we see that shift happening. And so the scenarios we've looked at here have quite aggressive moves towards electrification, electric vehicles, electric appliances, and the commensurate shift in patterns of energy consumption associated with that. And then once we built up that picture of the demand side, then we work out how do we best provide all of those different types of energy, the fuels, the electricity, from the supply side, while also meeting our emissions and electricity targets. We use a set of conservative assumptions about the technologies we include. For the most part, those are existing technologies, and we used cost projections from public sources. And Fred outlined the primary one that we use, which is NREL ATB. So we see offshore wind price declines that are pretty significant over time. And actually, since this study was conducted, NREL is even more bullish on price declines for offshore wind. So we would maybe see earlier offshore wind development with new prices from NREL than we see in this study. And then the last point here on the study methodology is that we are integrating our solution across electricity and fuel systems and beyond state borders. And so we get this nice sort of synergistic solution, thinking about how do we solve our energy needs question all together. So we capture those regional opportunities. We capture the benefits of being able to produce fuels with electricity, etc. So we get a lower cost solution than if we were to look at siloed electricity system, fuels, etc. The goals of this project were, as Shannon is pointing out, inform policymaking in Oregon by examining technical and economic implications of decarbonization. And we, at the beginning of the project, identified some key questions we wanted to look at. So what if Oregon had an economy-wide net zero emissions target? Our base assumption is the targets Oregon has on the books right now, going to 80%, but Oregon is sandwiched between two much larger loads, Washington and California, that are going to net zero. And there are net zero targets set in other states around the West. And so we wanted to look at what if we did push to that net zero target. And what if Oregon were restricted from building new gas plants? We actually made that limitation across the West. So we can't just shift building gas plants from Oregon to somewhere else. We just can't do it. So how do we compensate for that? What if Oregon had to meet its emissions and clean electricity targets with only in-state resources? And then what if Oregon moved more slowly on transitioning energy consuming technologies to clean alternatives through electrification? So this is that case where if we had policy in place to transition our demand side to greater electrification, maybe there are hurdles that we encounter that make that transition slower than we expected or that we wanted. And what is the impact of that on overall costs and investment strategy? I wanted to just put the high level takeaways up front here, maybe give some context for understanding the highlight results. So first is that Oregon's 2035 emissions target is achieved mostly by just removing coal from the electricity portfolio. Those states that have a lot of coal in electricity right now, they have quite a low cost pathway to get pretty significant emissions reductions in the early years of the transition, and that's something that Oregon has to take advantage of here. And then replacing that with new clean resources while electrifying the demand side, we get reduced energy demands because we're going to higher efficiency electrified appliances, electric vehicles, etc., and lowering overall demands. Then second, Oregon is contributing to regional energy solutions with offshore wind investment by 2050. There's really a large build out of economic offshore wind in our modeling results, about 20 gigawatts by the time we get out to 2050. And a large portion of that is being exported to other places. So Oregon becomes a major exporter of electricity to other states in the West. And a lot of that is flowing south into California. We have pretty significant expansion of Oregon transmission connections to other states. Our baseline assumption here was that we could expand current pathways by up to 6 gigawatts. And that was priced pretty conservatively. Fred pointed out a couple of options for transmission expansion. This is one area where I think that we might want to do some further investigation, because as it is very advantageous to be building out transmission, it's also very difficult to. So investigating what if we couldn't get transmission expansion? I think that's a valuable question for Oregon, particularly where Oregon is located. It's really a hub between two much larger loads, north and south, as well as power flowing from east to west. There's that valuable onshore wind resource in Wyoming and Montana, and a lot of that will come through Oregon if we're able to expand the transmission there. And then on cost, we see approximately 0.2% additional GDP per year requirement there. But by the time we get to 2040, then we're into net benefit territory, where it's actually cheaper in our decarbonization case than in our reference case. Emissions targets, I think everybody will be familiar with this. Executive Order 2004 established this 45% and 80% target in 2035 and 2050 respectively. And so that is our baseline emissions assumption that we're using in the modeling. We have this set of 80% cases where we look at achieving that goal. by 2050, as well as we have the electricity target in Oregon as well. So we're getting to 100% clean electricity in those later years. So scenario descriptions, we designed our scenarios to answer those questions that I posed up front. So we have our 80 by 50 case. What do we do to achieve Oregon's existing targets? We have our no new gas case, but we do allow extension of existing gas in that case. So gas that is set to retire because it's coming to the end of its life, we can extend that gas through investment in keeping it around for another 20 years. 80 by 50 electricity proposal. So this was Oregon's specific electricity proposal that we investigated. That actually came out during the study. So we'd already done a lot of runs where the electricity proposal had mirrored what Washington State is doing in the Clean Electricity Transition Act. This updated that to include Oregon's specific proposal. Then 100 by 50, so pushing that emissions target, 100 by 50 in-state only. What if we could only use resources from Oregon to meet that? And then our low transformation case where we don't get as much on the demand side as we might have expected or wanted. Final energy demand, this is that picture of how our energy demands evolve as we start to buy different types of appliance, different types of vehicle. Industry starts to shift from use of gas to use of electricity in different processes, etc. So our reference case there shows if we didn't do that, what does it look like in Oregon as we see population growth, growth of the economy, and we see a small amount of growth in final energy demand over time. We have a COVID drop in the first few years there. We assume that we're back on track by 2023. The economy is basically recovered by 2023. Core decarbonization is where we are aggressively decarbonizing on the demand side. For example, by 2035, all sales of light duty vehicles must be electric. So we see this really significant 90% growth in the electricity sector over that time, but a commensurate decrease in fuel demand in end uses. And overall, we get about a 38% decrease in and then finally, we have low transformation on the right where, excuse me, where we see a similar amount of action taken, but we are just moving more slowly. So we don't quite get to that 38% decrease. We're at 29% by 2050 there. So what do we do on the demand side? So electricity here, generation and load. We see load on the bottom there, where bulk load serving all of those demands is in gray. And then red is what we're exporting to other places. So you see exports picking up quite significantly by 2050. To meet the load, we are building out more renewables. We're also importing some renewables in the early years from other states. And we see that really significant uptick in offshore wind generation by 2050. So about half of all of the generation in the 80 by 50 case comes from offshore wind. And the same thing in the 100 by 50 case as well. This is reflected in the capacity. So offshore wind is shown in green there. And you'll see in most cases, we get to about 20 gigawatts of offshore wind. This is because we're using NREL potentials. And NREL potentials are divided into groups that are differentiated by cost and quality of resource. We hit the potential caps of a couple of groups there, and we don't push beyond that because the next tranche is too expensive. It's not economic to do so. And so that's why we see a pretty similar amount of offshore wind in each one of these cases. Another significant component of the solution here is hydrogen supply and demand. So we're decarbonizing the whole economy. And by the time we're getting out to 2045, 2050, we are having to use some clean fuels in our demands for things like jet fuel, shipping, etc., in order to be able to get under those emissions targets. And hydrogen is one way of providing that. Hydrogen has this double duty benefit where we're both producing a clean fuel, excuse me, we're producing a clean fuel, which is helping us meet our emissions target. But at the same time, we get this incredible balancing resource for the grid because we don't need to consume hydrogen when we produce it. We can produce the hydrogen, we can convert that into, say, a liquid fuel, jet fuel, for example, and then that can be stored to be used at any time of the year. And so we produce more hydrogen in those parts of the year where we have higher renewable output, and then we store that and use it other times of the year. That means we can balance our grid by backing off this large new industrial load at times of the year when we don't have as much renewable availability. And so this is a substitute for a long-term storage resource and a lot cheaper than an electrochemical long-term storage option. This is an example of balancing the system. So I have Oregon on the left, Western states on the right-hand side there. And I just pulled a couple of example days, one from December, 24-hour dispatch, one from July. And the July day is one where we have a lot of renewable availability in Oregon. You can see that on the generation top half of the chart there with all of that blue wind. We have hydro, we have a lot of solar. And then on the December day, we have a lot lower output from those resources. Load is on the bottom there, so capturing all of that renewable output, we have a major uptick in electrolysis. So we're taking advantage of all of those available electrons. And then on the left-hand side there on the December day, then we are backing off the electrolysis significantly. And so we're able to balance our load by shifting that electrolysis up and down. The other component of this is the green part of the chart there, which on the load side, that's exports to other states. And so we're exporting a lot of that generation from the wind to other places in the West. And if you compare this to the Western states on the right, there isn't really a lot of correlation there between the availability of renewables in Oregon versus the availability of renewables in the West, just because a large portion of the Western resource portfolio is solar. And solar is largely available on both of these days in places like the Southwest. And so we see this complementary nature between resources available kind of in the Northwest from the Montana, Wyoming onshore wind resources, Oregon offshore, and the solar available in the Southwest. Transmission expansion is shown here. So 2020, 2050, top and bottom, we see a really big increase in strengthening the electricity grid over that period of time. A lot of that is coming in the connections between the eastern, northeastern states, Wyoming, Montana, to the states around it in order to be able to get this east to west shift of renewable resources across the West. And a lot of this is also filtering down into California, that largest load in the West, where we see this major corridor developing, Montana, Washington, Oregon, California. The extent to which we build out transmission to Oregon, going east to west, is going to be contingent on the plans that California has for building out HVDC lines. We haven't included that in this project, but California has plans for HVDC lines that are going out to New Mexico and going out to Wyoming. And that would change the patterns of flows a little bit here. We might not see as much need for the pathway through Idaho to bring power east to west and then south. Oregon's main balancing resources here are shown for January, April, July, and October. And I just wanted to show this because of the differences across seasons. We have this seasonality in the shape of renewable output. In the winter, we have less renewable output. In summer, we have more. And that's reflected here in how the system is balanced. So net transmission flow is one of the major ways that Oregon is balancing the grid. We're exporting in the shoulder periods of the day, and we're importing during the middle of the day. So taking advantage of that solar resource that's coming from California and Southwest in the middle of the day, and then exporting wind in the night, basically. Then electrolysis and electric boilers, you see in the summer months, April through July, we have a lot of electrolysis activity. In January, we have less. And so that's reflecting that seasonal balancing that's provided by a new industrial load that is giving us that clean fuel, but also giving us a really flexible balancing resource for the grid. Cost comparison here between various different cases. We don't really see a significant increase in cost relative to the reference case, 0.2% of GDP in the first few years. But then as we get out to 2040 through 2050, that's when all of these technologies that we're installing on the demand side, our offshore wind, our other renewable resources, the cost declines have been pretty significant. We've also moved past that point where we've electrified a lot of our loads on the demand side. And at that point, we get these cost savings happening. So we end up in 2045 and 2050 at a lower cost than what we see in the reference case. So key takeaways here. We're meeting our 2035 emissions target by removing that coal from the portfolio. And so that's a pretty easy first step. We don't need to do anything with clean fuels or anything particularly expensive to meet that first target. And that's kind of in contrast to what we see in Washington to the north, for example, where clean fuels are required in 2030. So their marginal cost of an emissions reduction is much higher than in Oregon, where there's all that coal to get rid of in the early years. Position between the two much larger loads, and that's driving a lot of the resource decisions. You know, if Oregon was going it alone, we wouldn't see nearly as much offshore wind development because a lot of that is being built to export to other markets as part of a regional least cost solution. And Oregon's supporting that regional energy solution with this offshore wind development, 20 gigawatts built over 15 years. And this is a question that came up in the course of technical review in the study. Is this a rate at which Oregon could build out this resource? And it seems like, given current estimates, this is about what entities in the state think is possible. Then second, on transmission, we see this large expansion of Oregon transmission connections to other states, 6 gigawatts to California, 3.4 gigawatts to Idaho, and facilities import and export of clean energy, taking advantage of geographic and resource diversity. We get that complementary nature between the resources being built. We're exporting clean energy to California, importing from California and Southwest when they have high solar output. And we see this east to west movement as well, taking advantage of the low cost and high quality wind in Wyoming and Montana. By decade, the key actions that we're seeing as being the most beneficial to reach decarbonization in the future for Oregon is first retiring coal. That's our most impactful near-term strategy, taking that out of the portfolios. Policy development here is what are the steps needed to eliminate coal from generation portfolio. Electrification of transport and buildings. That's going to lead to lower decarbonization costs. If you notice in that cost chart, it's a lot lower cost to be decarbonizing the demand side earlier rather than the slower route. And so how best to promote the shift to electrified end uses, how to minimize the adverse impacts of doing so. Regional operations, so taking advantage of out-of-state clean resources, exporting energy to other places, and planning for reliability are key for efficient decarbonization across the West. And that's going to take a long time to develop the coordination necessary. You know, our modeling is assuming that the West is a single balancing area. We're not taking into account the contractual arrangements that exist right now. And so what are the things that are going to be the largest roadblocks to overcome there? What are the next steps to promote that greater coordination? In the 2030s, renewable energy investments in the state really begin to grow pretty significantly. We have onshore wind and solar first, followed by this large and rapid growth of the offshore wind. And there's a question about the rate at which that happens. You know, if by that time offshore wind is a well-established industry, we may not have an issue with having a concentrated ramp up of 2-3 gigawatts a year. 100% electrification sales by 2035 across light duty transportation and buildings. Transmission expansion. So that's when that 6 gigawatts, 3.4 gigawatts starts to be valuable. So in the 2030s is when we see that transmission expanding, and then greater regional coordination to facilitate clean energy transfers. And then finally, key actions in the 2040s. This is where electrolysis comes into play, because we need that synthetic fuel at that time. All of the states in the West, in our 100% or net zero case, they are all requiring to decarbonize their economies completely. But there are parts of the economy that you can't electrify or are very difficult to electrify with today's technology. So we need clean fuels for those portions. So hydrogen is one way of producing that. And between hydrogen and biofuels, we see a clean fuel solution to that. And on the electrolysis side, that gives us this additional balancing capability. And then electrified end uses, we reach close to the 100% penetration mark in many sectors of the economy. And we reach that 20 gigawatts by the end of the decade of offshore wind in Oregon. So I will leave it there and open up for questions, or maybe Shannon, we're just moving straight on and we'll get to questions at the end.
Yes, option B. Thank you, Jeremy.
All right.
Very much appreciated. Next up is Dhruv Bhatnagar. He's a senior systems energy engineer with Pacific Northwest National Laboratories. He leads projects related to the integration of emerging energy technologies across technical, economic valuation, and regulatory perspectives. A particular interest to us here is his work on efforts for valuation and planning for marine energy and offshore wind resources. Today, Dhruv will share with us his recent work and contributions to grid valuation for ocean and offshore wind technology. This study is also the basis for Oregon's recently passed HB 3375, which states a state offshore wind planning goal for 3 gigawatts by 2030, in contrast to the work that Jeremy just presented. Thank you, Dhruv.
Shannon, can you hear me okay and see my screen?
Looking good.
Great. Thanks for the kind introduction. Hi, everyone. Dhruv Bhatnagar with Pacific Northwest National Lab. And I'll talk about, as Shannon mentioned, our work on the grid valuation of offshore wind energy, but also highlight some of the work we're doing on marine energy, sort of parallel pathways. And actually some of our offshore work came out of a discussion on our marine energy work from the OREC conference a couple of years ago. So love this conference. So maybe Shannon shared the HB 3375, and actually Fred shared some of our findings. So that'll make maybe a little bit go a little bit quicker through some things. I just want to acknowledge our support from BOEM, Sarah, Whitney, and Nessie, and partnerships from Odo, Jason, and Adam, and John Schott at BPA, who were really instrumental to getting going through this work. So the report is available on our website, and you can also just Google the title. So getting into it, key findings are that key findings are that regional transmission, which is existing transmission systems, may be able to carry up to between 2 and 3 gigawatts of offshore wind on the Oregon coast without significant sort of regional transmission upgrades required. The offshore wind deployment on the coast would relieve some historic transmission flows, particularly opening up some transmission availability through the gorge, the path 5 going from east to west through the Columbia River Gorge, which may let some additional renewables out further east, serve load centers in Oregon, Washington, without the need for new transmission. We also found, comparing resources, that offshore wind naturally complements loads better than existing onshore wind, and that the offshore wind does in fact complement solar and hydro too. And I'll get into that in a minute. So quick context, and I think we've talked a lot about this so far today. And it's very exciting. There's a great offshore wind resource on the Oregon coast. Jeremy and Fred both highlighted some of the clean energy targets in Oregon, and then also, of course, in Washington and California. We expect a lot of electrification with transportation of the industries, but their challenges, of course, still exist. Offshore wind has high capital costs. There's plentiful and low-cost hydropower, limited load growth. If you don't count electrification, natural gas is still widely used, and of course, there's the topographical and transmission challenges that still exist. So getting into it, we used a production cost model of the Western Interconnect, which basically is a dispatch model to dispatch resources across the year. It's developed by OREC, so industry vetted from that perspective. And we added 4 offshore wind sites on the Oregon coast. You can see them here: Astoria, Newport, Reedsport, Port Orford. Thanks to our friends at NREL. And NREL, we used the NREL toolkit for resource data over a 7-year period. And when adding those resources to the existing model, which is a model of the 2028 system, we found that you could really deploy about 2 gigawatts equally spaced across those sites, with really no curtailment. And at 3, you start to see some 10 to 30% curtailment. NREL recently has been working on a more detailed study building on our work, and they're finding some broadly similar results. They looked a little bit more in depth into sort of the transmission interconnection issues. So as I mentioned, resource complementarity in the summer, and I won't really go into the graphs here too much, but there are complementarity graphs available in the report if you'd like to dive in. In summer, we find the offshore wind, which stays consistent in the summer, helps to balance land-based wind in the gorge and Southeast Washington, which drops a bit in the summer. Also complements solar in Eastern Oregon and Washington, which of course does go down quite a bit in the summer. Looking at comparison to other wind resources, this is ramp rates over 15-year periods, comparing the offshore wind resource to Wyoming wind, and we really see an overall reduction in ramp rates, just looking at the resource data in 15-minute increments, and that really sheds light on the smoother output of the offshore wind resource, and perhaps less balancing reserves required to maintain grid reliability in a future system where you have offshore wind deployed. Quick touch of hydro. Of course, hydro has been plentiful, and we've heavily relied upon it throughout the years. But with climate change, potentially changing snowpack and impacting hydro. And of course, there's a lot of work at the lab and the Power Council and elsewhere in the region to really look at, what we can expect from that. We might see changes in hydro output. So whereas the other, land-based wind resources here on the right maybe drop off in mid to late summer, offshore wind stays fairly consistent, which shows some value in a future system where we have some of those hydro changes. Brett highlighted this when we look at just the resource gross capacity factors, particularly during peak hours, and of course, as this is on average, we find some fairly high numbers, between around 40 to 60%. Better going further south where the resource is better on the coast, 40 to 60% during those peak hours, and really highlighting that capacity value that offshore wind might present to a future clean energy system, or even in the near term. Of course, when you deploy offshore wind on the coast, if you're deploying offshore wind on the coast, a lot of that load will be served by that offshore wind, the coastal load, which of course has reliability and resilience impacts, and we see that in the model where you see transmission flows. Typical coastal range transmission flows are going from the east to the west across the range. You see that a big shift, delivery of energy to those load centers, to those loads, and then energy going east into sort of the I-5 transmission corridor. Just highlighting what I mentioned about the pathways. We looked at pathways, going south in California and also coming from Idaho, and but this is path 5 in particular, just because it is the gorge path that is one of particular interest. As you, this is hourly average, as you increase over the year, as you increase the deployment of offshore wind, you really start opening up that transmission pathway. Really maybe making some headroom for additional resources without, additional renewable resources from the east without the need to build more transmission. So all of these elements really kind of are highlighting that there's a lot of value and grid value that can be attributed to offshore wind, or that the deployment of offshore wind could capture. But it's not always clearly identified in levelized cost of energy numbers, or even typical sort of regional analyses, and you really have to dive in a little further to see some of those benefits that are really there, but are hard to quantify. And I'm happy to announce that we have continuing work on this effort with the support of the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium. In the next about 18 months, we'll be looking, really diving into transmission and how deploying of offshore wind on Oregon coast and Northern California can be enabled through different transmission planning paradigms. So we'll be looking at different transmission scenarios and really diving deep into sort of power flow and localized impacts to really get an idea of what transmission might need to look like if we want to integrate higher levels of offshore wind. And with support of BOEM, we're hoping that we can start looking into San Francisco as well. But really, I hope this we're hoping will sort of set some groundwork for future sort of regional coordination amongst states, and thinking about how we get that offshore wind onshore. I quickly want to highlight our work on the marine energy side. We recently completed the phase 1 of our grid value proposition of marine energy project here at PNW. It was with NREL and also help from partnerships with POET and Oregon State. The executive summary is available. If you'd like to email me, I'll be happy to share that with you. And similar to offshore wind, but perhaps even a bigger challenge with marine energy. You can't compete with existing resources, existing land-based renewable resources on just that cost basis. The levelized cost of energy for marine energy resources, wave, tidal, ocean current, is quite a bit higher. But nonetheless, we find that there are lots of unique aspects of the marine energy resource that may provide competitive or unique benefits that may be ripe for deployment now or in the near term. But again, many of these benefits are not compensated, quantified or even established in grid planning communities. And even when they are recognized, it's quite hard to quantify many sort of those benefits that I'll get into. Looking at Oregon specifically, we looked at a timing value analysis, so the timing of the resource output. This is an assumption, we have wave based on the wave resource off the Oregon coast. We did an analysis of a system that would have a high renewable energy system composed of wave, solar, and wind, just sort of as an example to deliver energy to the Pacific Core system in Southern Oregon. And we find that when we set that up, marine energy and wave in particular had a higher load carrying capacity than wind and solar. And that really goes at the capacity value of the resource. The added diversity of using the wave resource there showed a 20% reduction in the need of balancing reserves to maintain reliability. That translates directly to cost savings in either natural gas use or energy storage or other resource build out. And then in a parallel analysis that was more focused on energy storage, we found that in an energy storage, using energy storage as a balancing reserve resource and storage resource, we found that deploying marine energy relative to solar and wind could reduce storage needs by up to 40% there. Jumping to analyses on islands and remote communities. We've done some work with National Grid on Nantucket to look at energy storage, and building on that work, we also looked at marine energy deployment on the Nantucket system. There's both a wave and tidal resource, although neither of those are very significant, but nonetheless, on the distribution side, we find reliability improvements using marine energy by in way of reduced tap changes and load flow issues, particularly in sort of extremities of their distribution system, and also from a resilience aspect, we're able to highlight or shed light on the quantification of resilience value with that added diversity of a marine energy resource. Assuming one of the one or two of the transmission lines that deliver most of the energy to Nantucket were unavailable. This is sort of highlights, the value that could be present in a truly remote system, a remote island where you don't have reliance on those incoming transmission lines from the Cape in this case. That added diversity of marine energy and also really that persistence in the output and maybe reduction in sort of variability provides some real value in sort of reliability and resilience. And finally, we also looked using the Molokai Island as a base system. We thought about a microgrid for that island. The peak load is only 5.7 megawatts, so really it's a microgrid that covers the entire island. We used a tool that we have at PNW called MCOR, Microgrid Component Optimization for Resilience, to evaluate a PV, wind, and battery system that had a biofuel generator, and compared the addition of wave, which is very prominent on Molokai's North Shore, to PV, wind, and the biofuel use. So at a high level, when adding wind or wave actually reduces the total renewable and battery capacity required to maintain zero emissions. So basically eliminating the need for a generator when we're using wave in place of PV. So that first we see for the 2 BPA type of wave device, we see a 47% reduction in capacity needed relative to PV, 17% in battery capacity needed relative to PV. And then adding wave energy, actually we have identified even better than wind, allows for a better resilience. So the MCOR tool is intended for resiliency analysis. And you see about in simulations where the capacity cutoff is reached, where you continue to increase capacity to ensure resiliency over a 14-day period, for example, Wave performed the best in terms of the fewest simulations where you would see those resilience impacts. So just quickly highlighting the same, particularly on the right, bottom right, is the added wave and the diversity of the resource there. And so just want to quickly highlight, there's a lot of interesting things going on the wave and tidal side. I think we'll get into that in the rest of this conference. So thank you, Shannon and Jason, for inviting me. I hope looking forward to the discussion. And thanks everyone for your time.
Excellent. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, everyone. We have a published stop time of 11:45. However, there is not a panel right after this. So if folks have some questions that they'd like to drop into the chat, please do, and we'll go ahead and extend until 11:50 if there's an interest. I think everyone is just dumbfounded and taking in all of the information that was just shared here.
There is a question for Drew from Shanna Hirsch in the Q&A.
Oh, I see it. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Fred. Yeah, I can actually, we've presented some of that work we recently, my colleague Sarah Newman presented that at UTech, and that will be available through there. For our broader report, we're pending final authorization and hopefully hope to release that soon. But if you want to reach out to me, I'll be happy to share. I'll be happy to share that.
What's next for PNNL's work on the grid value of MHK?
Thanks, Jason. Good question. So we actually have continuing, thanks to support from the Water Power Office at DOE, we have continuing funding for a next phase of the project, and really hoping to dive into some of the value we've illustrated in the first phase to really get at partners in the field and quantification and get into that a little bit more. On that note, if there's any interest out there, please reach out. We would love to talk and engage and potentially partner.
On a related note, Jeremy, I wonder, at one point I had heard talk of revisiting your work in the form of decarbonization analysis pathways for the Pacific Northwest and Oregon. Is there anything that you can share on that for subsequent work that might be underway?
Yeah, so it's in the planning stages at the moment. A few years ago, or a couple of years ago, we released the Northwest DDP, which covered all of the Northwest states, and we're planning to do an update of that in the coming months.
Great, thank you. Let's see, here's a question from Jason Bush for Fred. How do you think HB 2021 is Oregon's new 100% clean legislation that passed last year? How do you think that will affect the trajectory of the energy market in the Pacific Northwest? Was the trajectory already fairly clear, or did 2021 make a big difference?
A bit of both. I think we had the previous renewable portfolio standard set in 2015, and this advances that. I'd say in general, our investor-owned utilities in Oregon, primarily Portland General Electric and PacifiCorp, are moving forward on decarbonizing their mix. They're putting real money on the table. They're getting new resources pretty quickly. So that stage, this current stage, which is basically aimed at helping to cover coal retirements and additional issues on the grid, it's pretty in place. But what happens later in the decade and into the 2030s, that's where the new policy will really start to have a bigger effect. And it also converges with the potential, given the long lead times for offshore resources, both wind and all the other marine energy resources. That's a good fit because, we have some time to get things ready, but we need to have those things ready, by the end of the decade, by the latter part of the decade and into the 2030s. So I think that the new, and of course, we haven't even begun to really do the rulemaking around HB 2021. A lot of analysis will still need to happen, but it sets a pretty aggressive, but nonetheless doable target for achieving 100% by 2040, and gives us a strong incentive to make things happen.
Drew, you mentioned that it's very difficult for us to quantify and monify some of those other benefits of MHK and offshore wind, such as economic development potential. In the framework that you are using, do you see a not too distant future where we might be able to overlay that as a sensitivity in our energy planning?
All right, unmute. Yeah, Shannon, that's a great question. Actually, I think some utilities have started to do that a little bit in planning, and I know the Power Council maybe has done that, a little bit of that too. But like you said, the quantification bit is hard. So often that gets, it becomes an element of a qualitative analysis. But yeah, I think more work into it and more sort of rigor around really trying to get at that, what that value looks like. Maybe you could start to overlay that as a sensitivity and use that as part of the sort of decision-making process. But really, with the need for moving towards higher levels of clean energy and HB 2021, I think some of that will materialize on its own because we'll no longer have to be able to rely on sort of the traditional resources we've used to get at the energy needs.
Thank you. There's a question, an anonymous question. Oregon has offshore wind specific targets through HB 3375 of 3 by 30. California is enacting a 3 by 30 and 10 by 20 offshore wind target. How can these states work together to meet their common targets instead of competing for megawatts? Great question. Anyone want to jump in on that?
Yeah, this is Fred. There's a lot of opportunities there so that we can have collaborative work and get more value out of the offshore resource. As I said, I think part of that's going to be sorting out the transmission issues, in particular whether an Oregon to California link is possible. And that requires both technical, physical feasibility and cost concerns. And inevitably, there's going to be issues about cost allocation and so forth. It's a big agenda, but we have a big task. And one thing we know is that the offshore resource is really big.
And I would add to that the comprehensive evaluation of the use of our ports and supply chain development, in addition to the transmission, would also further that cause. Another comment here, you mentioned Northern California and Oregon. Are there any updates on Washington offshore potential?
Good question. I think, well, I guess maybe, I don't know if Fred has more insights on this, but most of the wind and wave resources kind of focused in that Southern Oregon, Northern California region in particular. So a lot of interest is there right now. I know there's some potential in Washington, but it's not the same quality.
Yeah, but on the other hand, the South Oregon to Humboldt area has some of the best offshore wind in the world, certainly in North America. But the offshore wind further north is pretty good. Capacity factors in the 40s to even low 50s. And the key thing about Washington offshore is it's a lot closer, and the transmission issues are arguably easier to deal with than for the Puget Sound load center in particular as a major issue. So with a relatively lower cost for getting the wind to the load offset the lower capacity factor is kind of a fundamental underlying issue. There are other issues as well, fishing, other marine uses, habitat. Those are issues everywhere. They're going to be different in different areas. Those are things that can be worked through. I really have not seen much of an assessment of Washington offshore potential, but we know it's there.
Well, we are at the close of our time. I want to thank everyone for participating. This was a great panel. Thank you, panelists, for joining us. I am up here in Portland. I'm usually down on the South Coast. If anyone's in the Portland area and would like to gather and talk more about these and other topics, meet us at the White Eagle tomorrow, Thursday, the White Eagle Saloon, 4:30 to 6:30 for a casual gathering of like-minded ocean energy geeks. All right, we'll see you after lunch. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Shannon. That was an excellent panel. Jeremy, thank you. You're a trooper for pushing through. And I'm so glad we weren't in the same room today. So here's the virtual presentations. But to the rest of the group, Fred, Drew, Jeremy, and of course, Shannon, thank y'all so much for this very interesting. I think it speaks to the amount of work and effort that's going on behind the scenes today from the Department of Energy, from Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and other entities that are funding the essential studies that are so important to helping all these sectors move forward. So appreciate the good work you guys are doing. I look forward to the next round of reports, which we know there are several in process. So lots of important questions and challenges ahead of us. I know that we're all up to the challenge to lean into those. So with that, we are at the end of our time. I think it's been an excellent morning. Thank you all so much for your contributions and participating today. We're going to take a break now for lunch. We'll be back at 1 o'clock for the next panel on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So enjoy your lunch and join us again at 1 o'clock. And by the way, if you didn't notice, at the bottom of the Whova app for this panel that you just watched, there are a couple of excellent reports that you can download right there, make them easily available to you. So with that, thank you very much, and we'll see you at 1 o'clock Pacific time. Bye-bye.